Today, what we're talking about is the art of subtext, and many of the things we've been talking about are these topics that you feel like, yeah, I know what that is, and then if somebody asks you to define it, you're like, well, yeah. So it's one of those things that I think we all recognize when it's happening, and appreciate when it's happening, but to try to figure out how to accomplish it, it takes a little bit of thought. So the little bit of thought that I put into it, subtext is the art of what's not said.
Subtext. I feel like I'm no good at it. I don't know. It's sort of like, oh yeah, that is in there, isn't it? And then I'm just like, I gotta try and write it now. How do I write it if I'm not saying what I want to say?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, a lot of the guidance that I've seen from like Masterclass and other things online recommend that you sort of observe it in nature as much as anything. So if you're in a conversation or overhearing conversations, I know we've talked a lot about sitting at the coffee shop, kind of working on your own thing, and you overhear other people talking. Subtext is happening all around us all the time. And I think modeling real world conversations requires you to be very observant in the real world. So how often have you had a conversation, especially in the past, where you were hesitant to say what you really meant, but you were still, communicating what you wanted to say, whether you meant to or not, by really what you were omitting as much as by what you were saying. So you've seen in movies or on stage, people taking an action, a physical action, that means something to a character, and they're doing it on purpose, and they're sort of communicating something meaningful without saying anything. And I think that's a form of subtext through action.
Yeah.
I read one that I hadn't remembered, but it was from The Great Gatsby, and I love talking about Gatsby. It's one of my favorite books. But apparently, there's a scene where Gatsby's like stacking up a bunch of expensive shirts, and he's doing it in front of Daisy, and so it's almost like kind of showing off his wealth. And I think the conversation, because Nick's there too, I think the conversation's around, how shitty is your marriage? And he's just stacking up all these expensive shirts. It's basically showing her, here's what you've missed out on, but it's right here. And I think, because it's been a long time since I've read it, but I think she gets kind of flustered and frustrated through the course of
Yeah.
that interaction because she's seeing it as a missed opportunity. And she's like, damn it,
Yeah.
why didn't I go with this other guy? I mean, that's subtext. He didn't say any of that, but he was communicating it, and she was picking it up. So like, a character who's kind of picking up what you're putting down probably is a good way of thinking about subtext. So it doesn't necessarily have to come through dialogue. In fact, if it does happen through dialogue, it's not going to be direct communication. It's not going to be, you hurt my feelings.
Right.
It's gonna be something else. Like, let's say a character is allergic to mushrooms, and so their roommate cooks them a special dish and makes sure that it's just chock full of mushrooms. Right? What is that saying to that roommate? Clearly it's
Right.
a message of f you or whatever it could be. But that I think that's a form of subtext where you're clearly communicating something. In that instance, I think hostility, yeah, I think hostility is probably a good way of putting that. But they didn't yell, they didn't curse, they didn't say anything. It's what they did.
Yeah. It's what they did. Yeah. Let me ask you this because we've talked about this before. There, in the very first, I think a little chunk that I sent you of the novel that I'm working on for this season, I tried to introduce two of the characters who work in the candle shop in the mall where this whole thing takes place by introducing what they were doing to try and tell the kind of people what they are. One of them is running through a opening checklist of what to do to open the shop, and the other one is just gabbing and not doing anything. So I was trying to do with those two actions was show the type of people they are without like having long, long paragraphs of like, and then at 18, such and such a character went to Juilliard for violent. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is that possibly a part of it?
Yeah, I think so. No,
Right?
I think you've hit it. Your first person narrator, because it's first person, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
It is not. No.
Okay, good. So it's third person, but man, it feels like first. In my head, I thought it was first. So that's a really good
I know
sign.
you. That's I always really appreciate that's something that you always say about all of my stuff. You have this really weird third person that sounds like a first person, and I'm just like, yeah, thanks. I'm trying.
No, it works great because in my head I had transposed it into first person. But one of the things I remember, and look, I may be incorrect because it's been a little bit since I read it, but my recollection is that the narrator is doing a little bit of judging of the lazier character, the character who's
Yeah,
shirking her
yeah,
responsibility, and doing it directly or overtly. So if you wanted to do that through subtext, you would just sort of leave it there for the reader to infer rather than overtly state this disappointed her because blah blah blah. So I don't remember,
yeah,
how overt you were, but I'm just thinking like in general, if you say it out loud, even if you're the narrator sort of commenting on, well, this character thought that this other character was a jerk, you've lost the opportunity for subtext. Maybe that's not
yeah,
the right way to do it. Maybe you don't want subtext there. I don't think you have to do everything through subtext, but certainly
yeah,
it's almost like giving the reader the opportunity to decode the moment or read into the clues or decipher, the cryptex of the moment can be very satisfying for the reader because you haven't told them exactly how they should feel. And they've interpreted how people are, working through the conflict of the scene, and it can be very satisfying to feel that tension and sort of decode what's happening and figure out what they really mean rather than what they're actually doing. But yeah, I think you do some of that in that scene.
yeah. And I always feel, for me, trying to write that way is more interesting than being super literal because I don't like, and that's the problem. I think of the problem with a lot of my writing is that sometimes I try to do too much in subtext. See, now I'm gonna have to try and unlock the code. Am I like, oh, wait, I am doing subtext. Am I doing subtext? I think I'm doing subtext. So I'm sure about for the next 4 days after we record this episode, I'm gonna be like, oh, I should have said this because, oh, and I know this because, and I'll have all of my favorite examples of it. But yeah, I try not to be too literal. I'm like, I don't want the reader to be hand fed, spoon fed, or however you want to say it, everything. But sometimes I try to be too much subtext. And that's where people read my work and go, I think you left out a couple crucial details. Like, and so it's a tricky balance to find.
That's fair. That's fair. But the good news is that you can catch that stuff in revision. And, it just means that
Yeah.
you need a few more readers to give you feedback. Because if you start seeing the pattern,
Yeah.
you got three people who read your book and all three of them say this part felt weird, then it's not right. You got to go
Yeah.
back and take
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
take a look at it.
Yeah, yeah, which is opposite of what I used to do in college when I'd just be like, "No, no, 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 you don't understand. Let me explain it to you." No, you have to have it explained in the story so people don't have to have it explained. Everything that you need has to be in the story
I used
or
to
the
do that
book.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, oh well, let me just explain what it is, and then you'll get it. It's like, well, wait a minute, Art, you're not going to be sitting next to every reader who reads your story, so
Yeah.
that's unsustainable. So it's not their fault; it's you.
At UNO one semester, I took playwriting, I think it was, and at the end of the semester, they got the actors at UNO to do staged readings of the plays. And some of them were absolutely incredible. There's still a play that I remember called "Revenge is a dish best served cold, but macaroni and cheese is served better hot." Still, it was an amazing play. Anyway, but I just remember having my play read, and because this is definitely the person I was back then. I wrote a play about time travel, and that's all I wrote about back then. But I had one of the actors, I saw him on stage when they were reading the play, and some about 3/4 of the way through the play, he got this revelation in his face, and he looked right at me and he mouthed the words, "I get it." That was the greatest feeling I've ever had in my life.
That's awesome.
It only happened once. Everyone else is like, "What? No, what are you talking about here?"
Well, that
In most of my writing.
I imagine that is sustaining you to this day, in some
Yes.
respect.
Oh, I mean, for crying out loud, I'm bringing up the story 30, 40 years later. It's great. But yeah, subtext, man, it's a hard line to walk.
I like to skirt the line kind of on the side that you are, which is risking saying too little. Because if you get some good readers who point out, I really didn't follow here, I'm not sure what you're trying to do, then that's an indication, I need to be a little more overt. It's okay for me to be a little more on the nose. But I mean, melodrama as a thing is just painful to endure. And I mean, you see this a
Yeah.
lot in like soap operas, which they do not because they're schlocky, they do it because they have to do it. It's a best practice because you can be gone from a soap opera for weeks or months. And when you return as a viewer, you need to be caught up on the things that have occurred to the characters that you're familiar with. So they do a ton
Yeah.
of like exposition recaps every episode. And I think that's part of why the plot moves so slowly in those, because they don't want to go too far down the road and leave people, in the dust. But anyway, they don't do a lot with subtext because they need to be,
Yeah.
they need the audience to follow them directly. But any literary novel trades in it pretty heavily, you know?
I do feel like I'm trying to do a lot of subtext because writing a noir about a crime that's happened, I feel like the relationships between people have to be I really don't want they need to be a lot of subtext. There needs to be someone seeing someone talking to someone else. What is the relationship there? So I'm trying to develop relationships in that third person, but kind of through the eyes of the main character named Madeline Tin, who is solving this crime. So I'm trying to have her, like, for example, see someone talking to somebody and then trying to glean that relationship, or knowing that at some point that relationship between two people might end up being very seminal to the end when we decide, when we find out, who's committed the crime and how they did it and all that stuff like that. I feel like there's a lot of subtext that you can get in one of my favorite television shows, The Office, the British Office. I've never seen the American one, but the British Office, there was a lot of subtext about the relationships between people in the first couple episodes, like by the way that you see them interact with each other in the background as opposed to the foreground. And it lets you connect clues about the relationships. That's what I like, and that's what I'm trying to do more in my own writing. Whether or not I'm successful, that's another thing.
It's a function of editing. I mean, you can lay that
Yeah,
out as an aspirational goal and you can plant the seeds of that in your first draft. And you may actually nail it in certain areas in your first draft. But to get that
yeah,
just right, you've got to go back over it a few times. It's funny though,
yeah,
because the type of story that you've chosen is really good for subtext because you want to get people questioning what's happening. You're going to be providing some red herrings, but you're also going to be providing subtle clues. So you're trading in not giving people everything and forcing them, not really even forcing them. No, you're just encouraging them to try to piece it together themselves ahead of schedule. Because people are pattern recognizers, and folks who read this genre are going to want to see if they can be the inspector and kind of piece it together before the inspector does. And if you've done it well, they won't. It will be
yeah.
both surprising and inevitable. And that's the hardest part about the genre that you've chosen. It has to be surprising
Yeah.
and inevitable. No, the subtext through questioning is what I was getting at. The idea that you've got to get people looking for those clues, and that is a form of subtext because you're again not telling them overtly, hey, this is important, go follow the money, or whatever it is, they need to do it themselves.
Yeah. Last night, I got some tacos from my favorite place, Samitas El Tigre, here in Woodside. But they have a delightful margarita that you can order for takeout. And so I had half a margarita. And last night, while convincingly drunk on this margarita, because I'm a lightweight, I finally wrote that end piece where I put all of the details together, where my main character sort of explains how the crime was committed. And so now it's strange because I think in a way I've kind of written the outline for what I need to go back and plant earlier in the novel if I go back and read it and say, "Oh, this is worth it," or if I go back and say, "I better not write on a margarita from Samitas El Tigre in Woodside, New York." And so, yeah, it's fun because I feel like I've placed enough things in that kind of subtextual way that the ending right now kind of makes sense. It's a stretch, but I need to go back and add a couple of details to make it really, really work.
That's a really good approach to put notes into your work I know you do this with the all caps, where you're saying, "Oh, you got to go set up this, that, the
Yeah.
other." But yeah, I mean, to put the forward as here's the answer to the problem, essentially. I'm glad that you reached that because when I asked you if you were writing in sequence in a previous episode, and you said, "Yeah, I'm writing in sequence," I'm like, "Wow, that's awesome," because I would
Yeah.
approach that as really figuring out what happened first, and then try to plant it. But you've sort of been discovering it as much as you've been planting it, which I think works
Yeah.
very well.
Yeah, it's been really fun to kind of like, yeah, geez, maybe I am using a lot more subtext than I thought. I don't know, because I just feel like just writing about this day-to-day thing and then sort of, well, we should go do this, and then that opens the doors. It's just, there's just a ton of, and here we go with our weekly narrative improv. It's just a ton of yes anding and finding out what could happen next. And so it's
Yeah,
it's been really, really, it's really fun. I've gotten to 46,000, so I'm in the ballpark.
that's
All I
so
got to do
cool.
now is just sort of like, just kind of like do the whole epilogue thing and figure it out. And yeah, I think you had mentioned you were like, you got to put it away for a little bit, maybe like a month, maybe, I don't know. But I'm already thinking about how to solve problems I already know that I need to solve, and I'm very excited to do that. I think for a little bit I was very, very I got really depressed a couple days ago because I started writing this a segment, this sort of climactic moment, and I was like, I don't think I can do A, B, and D of this moment, but C is working. So it just kind of got to the point where it's like, oh my God, the amount of work that I'm going to have to do to make this readable really, really, really got to me. I was really like, I don't think I can do this. But then I was like, come on, you moron, just do it. And just try and have fun. That's what happens. If I can walk away from it and just be like, man, you just have fun with it. This is what you're trying to do. You're trying to write a book that you would love to read, that you would be excited to read. And so that's what kind of brought me back to it. So I don't know. I'm pretty close.
I'm glad.
Um,
I'm glad you're close for real. I mean, and however much time you want to take off between drafts is totally up to you. I do think you should take at least a few days off and like celebrate having finished it, and then come back to it
yeah,
when you're ready. I think a month is fine, or even a week or a few days if you're excited about it. I am using November. So we're recording this at the end of October. And I am
yeah,
committing to doing NaNoWriMo for November of 2023. That's the year that we're in. And so November 1, I am rushing up the mountain. So I'm hoping by the end of the month I will have caught you. I'm not going to cheat and say, well, I've already got 8,000 words, so I'm just going to do another 42 and we'll call it 50. I am going to do
yeah.
50,000. So because again, I think my target is really around 75. So if I've got eight,
Hmm.
then I'm going to shoot to reach 58 by the end of the month. It is very doable. I've been working very hard to offload a lot of the things that are taking time away from me. One of which is this podcast. So
Yes.
we kind of put a pin in planning season 3. We're going to take a hiatus after season 2, and just kind of focus on the work so we can come back fresh and have more stories to tell at that point. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to November because I'd like to sprint and try to catch you. But no, I think getting back to the whole subtext thing, you're doing it a lot more than you think you are because you have characters that have things in their past, have attitudes or ways of expressing themselves that you aren't fully shining a spotlight on. I've heard it called the iceberg theory, where you have somebody's
Yeah.
personality and that's kind of the top of the iceberg, and then everything else underneath the surface is really who they are.
Yeah.
And you've got tons of that. So, pretty much as you approach subtext, if you think of every character as an iceberg, and what is it that what are they allowing themselves to show to the world, and what's going on underneath, and how can I kind of hint at what's happening underneath without telling them directly, and that's your subtext. So I think you're doing it a lot more than you give yourself credit for.
Yeah, I think what ends up happening, and I'm trying to be more honest, when we talk about our respective, approaches. I am exceptionally lazy, or just maybe I should just say ignorant of like the terminology. So, in other words, when I'm trying to describe my work or trying to find out what I'm hung up on, I don't really know all of the right terminology that I should be using. And it feels a little like a kind of it feels embarrassing to say. It's like, well, subtext. Well, I don't really know. Give me some examples. I'm not really sure if I could talk about that. And so I think it's important if there are folks that are out there, um, that it's okay not to know all the terminology and stuff like that. It's just that's just the way that I am. So it'd be nice if all of a sudden I sort of realize, oh, wait a minute, I am doing something like that.
Yeah,
It's
I
just I
think
need to get better. Yeah,
yeah. Oh, I think that's true, Tim. I think a lot of the times we will make things more complicated in our heads than they need to be sometimes.
yeah,
And so, like, there's a really good cliche. I think this is an example of subtext and is kind of like a father and son who don't communicate very well, but they bond through sports. And so they might be both sitting on the couch and they can't talk about their real feelings, but they express it through their love of the sports team. And so you can play that out in your head. You've probably seen that 100 times. But that is a form of subtext. They're trying to tell each other that they care about each other, but for whatever reason, they aren't capable of saying those words. So they use a surrogate or a stand in to be able to express that. So that's a perfectly fine example of subtext. Just think about real life. You know, what are some real life examples of people who aren't saying what they mean? People who are trying to convey an emotion without directly conveying that. It might even be when characters uh, or real people can't control themselves from expressing, like people who have terrible poker faces, people whose bodies are animated and maybe they aren't really aware that they're giving away their attitude, they're giving away their frustration by their body language, by their facial expressions. But they're not saying they're frustrated. That is a form of subtext, you know, because you are
yeah.
clearly picking up what they're putting down, even if they don't intend to put that down.
Yeah, and using that subtext to say the larger things even thematically for the entirety. I think one of the other things that I'm trying to do that I've sort of been playing with is the idea that the main character is older, is middle-aged. And so I think everyone I've been trying to do it in a sort of just kind of like trying to comment on the fact that she's trying to solve a crime when she's just a candle shop manager, when she's just like, aren't you too old to be doing this? What is wrong with you? That kind of thing. And I've been trying to find subtler ways to say that so that it kind of because I'd really like to talk about the idea that the things that we wanted to be when we were younger, we don't really get the chance to do all of the things we want to be. There's so select few people who are uh, who have gone to space, who can actually go, who can be an astronaut, and they're like, oh, you can be an astronaut. Or I think it was I heard of an amazing statistic, and I think I even might have said it on an earlier episode about the fact that if you took every single person that has ever played Major League Baseball, you could not fill a stadium with them, and that's an incredible number to me. So
Wow.
I've really been trying to think about those kind of things and how we sort of fall into these kind of patterns of just, we just work and we forget what we wanted to do outside of work, and work overtakes us. So that's kind of something that I've also been playing with and trying to figure out how to do that thematically and subtextually. I think is something that I also need to look at in this book, along with the crime. The crime is facilitating these people who are starting to question, like, what are they? Are they just the person who does this 40-hour a week job, or can they be something other than that? So again, sounds great in theory. We'll see if it's in the text.
Yeah, no, I dig it. Are so does your main character question herself as to why she's trying to do this work in the first place? And that sort of negative thinking, is that trying to kind of redirect her onto quote unquote what she should be doing instead of what she really
Ye-
wants to do?
yes, I think there are a couple characters that I have in the book, and the main character, Madeline Tin, I've introduced as someone who is kind of single and sort of living in an apartment and going through the exact motion of every single day, of every single day, of every single day. And also, maybe as part of the subtext, I have been trying also to explain the characters by the bumper stickers they have on their cars. That's subtext, right?
Absolutely. I think so.
Good
Because
lord, I'm doing so much
I
subtext.
know, I told you it's there. It's one of those things that we all do if we're trying to write something better than melodrama. We're already doing it.
Yeah,
It's just about okay.
yeah,
So then the question is, all right, Tim and Art, I see how I'm writing subtext. Why does it matter that I'm aware of subtext as a concept? Why is it on the competency map? Like why in the world are we trying to do this in the first place? And I think it's because it's a really good way to model the real world because very
yeah,
rarely people say what they actually mean. Like that's just not the way it works. So if you can do this subtext, you're modeling the way that real people interact, which makes the narrative more plausible, in a way more believable, more natural, and so it's just easier for us to consume because it aligns with the way that we experience the world. And I think that's the right approach. It's not to show off how clever you are. And that was a mistake that I made 25 plus years ago. I was trying to write to express how clever I was, and I wanted to be the smartest guy in every room. And
yeah,
really, what people care about seems to be interesting people doing cool stuff. So, yeah, like you should just
yeah,
write that.
yeah, 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 yeah. And I think it's the same thing. I was trying to be too clever in not the same thing. I was trying to be too clever and too gimmicky and have the gimmick stand for something and have the gimmick be like a greater message. And I just didn't have like there are people out there who are natural talents at doing that kind of stuff. Like, I mean, I know this is going to be a pretty big leap, but again, I read Kurt Vonnegut in college and I was like, I want to be like that guy. I love that guy's writing, but I tried too hard. I didn't know how to write a story, an A plus B equals C, with enough experience to become someone who could write as well and as skillfully as Kurt Vonnegut. And so, yeah, I think it's tried to run before I walked, and now I've had like a zillion years of walking, and I'm trying to now at least lope.
The thing that I did poorly many years ago was that I understood the cadence of good writing. And so I just mimicked the cadence. And I didn't understand that the substance was more important than the cadence. And so I got really good at mimicking the cadence of strong writing. But it was empty in a way. It was like really just vapid and empty. So I'm excited to come back to the work, trying to focus on the substance, the meal and not the spices, because I feel like I've had enough practice at the cadence that I can do that without a ton of effort. So I can just sort of do the style that I'm comfortable with that people have liked and not worry about that piece of it. Now I can worry about, am I creating rounded characters? Am I creating interesting problems for them to interact with? Do I have a compelling villain? Things of that nature. So it's pretty daunting for me because I don't have a lot of experience with it, but it's very exciting to try, and that's what November is all about. I'm very excited to sprint and try to catch up because I do want to share my progress with you before the end of the year. The same way that you sent me Madeline Tin, I want to be able to send you a full movement of the book, even though parts of it are going to feel more like notes. I still want to be able to send it to you because it's got a pretty compelling twist, and I don't want to tell it to you. I want you to read it and experience it and tell me if you think it's compelling as well.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something I've also had to struggle with as well. Coming up on the end of this, my getting to 50,000 words, I have started thinking, I'm like, this isn't a good section. This is just me writing what's going to happen. So I need to I'm excited to go back and flesh out parts that are just sort of more like, I'm starting to be like, oh, this is just, I'm just writing a script here. I'm not writing anything about like anything that's going on in here. I'm just trying to, I'm just writing an outline. So yeah, I've had a lot of struggle mentally with how the end is coming, but I'm also like, I'm like, ugh. but I can fix that. And that's what feels very good to me. The fixing is going to take a lot of work and a lot of patience, and that is something that I don't have. So that'll be something that'll be really interesting to kind of fight against.
No, that sounds great. I'm looking forward to seeing you do it. It's going to be a lot of fun. So, just to wrap
Yeah.
up our conversation on subtext, subtext is the meaning that happens, below the dialogue, sort of beneath the surface, the stuff that people mean, not necessarily what they say. And so, if you find yourself, gentle writer, if you find yourself writing exactly what people think and your characters are speaking exactly what's on their mind and that there is nothing below the surface, try to get out into the real world and listen to some sample conversations from people just out in public and transcribe a few lines of those and just try to figure out like what's actually happening here. What do they mean when they say this? Because a lot of times people aren't really saying what they actually mean. They're kind of getting close to it. It's almost like they're walking up to the cliff's edge, but they're not going to jump off the cliff. They just want you to look down and say, "This is what I really mean." It's actually a lot of fun to kind of eavesdrop on conversations. I try not to do it too much anymore, but when I was first starting out, I found it to be very helpful to find the cadence of good dialogue. If you just transcribe what people say in a coffee shop, it doesn't make good dialogue. It's a lot of extra words. It's a lot of extra stuff that you have to wade through. But you can find phrases or nuggets that are really compelling that you can put into your dialogue. So as far as subtext goes, just kind of take a look at what people are saying and try to compare that to what you think they really mean. And there should be a gap between those two things.
Yeah, that would be a great exercise, and especially because I take the subway in New York City a lot, I'm sure I could get a lot of good stuff there.
Oh, I bet. Yeah. Well, so you
Yeah.
are going to finish your novel before the end of the year for certain. Do you think you'll have it done in early November?
I think I want to have 50,000 words. My partner has been doing a play in Detroit for the past month and a half. And before that, she was doing a play in California. And before that, she was doing a play. So she's back. And I'm very excited to have her back for the rest of this year. So I want to make my schedule clear. So my goal is to, within the next week, write the 4,000 words. I'm at a spot where I think 4,000 words would be able to close it down, and then give it some space, give it some time. I'll probably walk the dog a bunch and think of some things like, oh, wait, I could solve that problem or that problem. So yeah, I'm hoping in the next week I will have the end written, like literally the end on it, and be able to put it on the shelf for a bit.
That's great. It's like a baton race because as you are finishing, you're going to hand the baton to me, and I'm going to be sprinting in the month of
I
November.
I think that's very, very exciting because it's two different, very different approaches. I tried to do a NaNoWriMo a long time ago, and that was actually the first 50,000 word piece I wrote. And if you remember, because I was keeping up with you doing it, it took me until I think mid-January to do that. I didn't have the time to be able to do it all in November, so I'm really excited to see how you do it. Is it possible to follow? If folks wanted to follow your progress, you are on the actual NaNoWriMo website, correct?
I am.
Yeah, and does that mean that is it like a profile? Is it like a social media page where you can have followers and people that do that?
Yeah. So if you go out to nanowrimo.org and you search for people that you can, make your buddy or whatnot, I'm more than happy to have anybody join me in this quest. My handle is my coach art, and the book that I am working on, the working title is How to Craft the Bluest Marble. So that won't stick, but that's what it's called while I'm drafting it. I'm notoriously terrible at titles until they are done. And usually I pull a phrase or something from the book, excuse me, not the book, from the story. I have never written a book, but I'll pull something from a story that I'm like, oh yeah, that phrase really is kind of the nugget that would hang well on the front door. So we'll see, what it'll end up being called, but I am setting a goal of 50. I think it's going to end up being 58,000. I'm going to set the goal on November 1 because however many words I have already written of the book, that's going to be my starting point, and I'm just going to tack on 50,000 to that number. So anybody who wants to follow my progress or share your journey with me, I'm more than happy to buddy up with you on nanowrimo.org. So search for My Coach Art, and I will be there.
And also if you feel like it, send us an email. If you're writing a novel, if you got problems, if you're trying to get stuck in the mud, we have Tiffin Writing Workshop at gmail.com.
That's right.
I'm such a good podcast host. Oh,